What's up, history peeps? Today we're going to be going over apartheid history from the discovery by the European powers all the way to 1948 with the rise of the National Party and the rise of apartheid. The first thing that we really need to cover is European exploration, and our story is going to begin with the Portuguese. They are going to be searching for that infamous Northwest Passage to India. And so a couple of notable names that you should be familiar with. Diaz, Bartholomew Diaz, is going to round the Cape of Good Hope around Africa, and then Vasco da Gama is going to actually find a route to India. And so the Portuguese are going to establish little strongholds there, but they're not really going to care. They're going to care about India, which sets the stage for other European powers, and that is going to be the Dutch and the English. The Dutch are going to show up in 1652. They arrive, and essentially they start setting up their own kind of own identity. They start seeing themselves, as little trading partners. They have little farms, and life is pretty good until the Napoleonic Wars and England shows up. And long story short, a very long story short, they show up and they say, "Hey, Dutch, no more slavery, and you can't speak your language, and you're under our control now." And obviously the Dutch, who have been kind of on their own for a while, aren't going to really like this. And they're going to go on what's known as the Great Trek. It's very similar to the United States Manifest Destiny. They're going to get in covered wagons. They're going to traverse mountains and huge rivers like the Transvaal. And they're going to ultimately establish their own republics of the Orange Free State, the Transvaal, and Natal. And then our colonization story is going to kind of come to an end here with conquest of local native groups that you should be familiar with, such as the Xhosa and the Zulu. And really what's going to happen is that the Dutch are going to fall under the English realm, and they're going to kind of control these native wars for a while. And once the Zulu are kind of defeated, and then the Boers are going to start fighting for their own independence. All right. The Industrial Revolution hit South Africa, and South Africa has some of the largest repositories of diamonds and gold in the world. So that infamous European searching for gold and wealth, well, they're going to find it in South Africa. And that leads the way to England trying to annex. That leads the way to the scramble for Africa. And then there's some past laws that are set up, some racial laws. Blacks are going to do a lot of the work in the mines. There's going to be a color bar saying that only whites can have the superior jobs, blacks can have the inferior jobs. And then townships. Blacks are going to be confined to these reserve areas for them to be working. Keep in mind, they're working in their own nation, in their own country, under the guidance of white Europeans coming in. All right, let's set up some Boer Wars. There's two of them. The first one, the Dutch are going to win, and the second one, the Dutch are going to lose. But the Dutch call themselves Boers. It's kind of like the first Americans that set foot in Jamestown see themselves as English. Then over time, through generations, they see themselves as Americans. All right, so it's going to be England versus the Boers, and ultimately, the Boers win the first one because they refuse to fight a traditional war. They're fighting with camouflage. They're wearing tan colors. They're creating little trenches, and then the British are fighting with kilts and red colors and flag bearers, and it ends up being an epic failure. And so the Boers are going to win the first one. The second one, the English are going to fight very much in the same direction, fight the same kind of style of warfare, except they change their uniforms, and then they are having so much difficulty that they set up concentration camps, and that leads to thousands of civilians dying, not through like executions, but just because there's low supplies. They burn down a lot of the houses, confine people to these concentration camp areas, and that sets a lot of hatred and the seeds for just problems in the future. Jan Smuts is going to eventually become prime minister, but he's one of these commandos during the Second Boer War. Also interesting during the Second Boer War, a couple interesting things to point out. Mahatma Gandhi's there. He's an ambulance person. And then you also are going to have Winston Churchill that's going there for the adventure. So just a couple things that people often leave out of the history books. But anyhow, Union of South Africa. So this Boer War, concentration camps, basically England feels bad for it, and they say, we're going to create a Union of South Africa where everyone comes together. There's just one problem. There's a lot of hatred between the Boers and the English. The Boers really don't want the English there. They never have, they never will. And so that that territory is going to be create some problem. In other news, there's this thing called the Entrenched Constitution, which in the Cape it said that blacks and coloreds would be allowed the right to vote. And they're not going to give that up without 2/3 of Congress authorizing that. 2 houses of Parliament, my apologies. All right, and then we have in 1912, so 2 years after the Union of South Africa is created, we have the South African Native National Congress, which changes its name later to the ANC, the African National Congress. Who are these people? Well, they're largely middle class, they're largely wealthy. They don't seem to really be representing the common black cause, and their big thing is about multiracialism. If you get nothing else out of the ANC, it's nonviolence, it's multiracialism. They're going to try nonviolence for about 50 years, and it's not going to work so well, and eventually after Sharpeville, which we'll cover in the next video, they're going to change their tactic towards more violence in order to get the government to be unstable so that the government will change. It's not violence for violence sake. Ultimately, the Union of South Africa creates the Land Act, and it basically creates a reserve. And so you have 80% of the population living on 13% of the land, okay? And the whites controlling everything else. The ICU is an industrial and commercial workers union. It united dock workers and also rural farmers. So blacks coming together for uniting. In other news, the Communist Party of South Africa is going to be founded by European socialists after the 1917 Russian Revolution, and it's going to make a cause with the black workers fighting for equality. In other news, we have some Afrikaner nationalism. Starts with the Second Boer War, it has the Great Trek, and you're going to have the Union Party versus the National Party, and you have some of this eugenics being tied in, that the whites, through the Great Trek, they made it because of God's will, and that they are superior than all the others, which is a very dark path to go down. But anywho, we're going to move down here now to the All-African Convention. The APO plus, of course, the ANC, and their goal is to stop this bill that's supposed to be passed that's going to take away the right of blacks to vote in the Cape. They're going to protest, they're going to send delegations to England, and ultimately they're not going to be successful, and it seems that nonviolence, it seems that protest will not work. So, Amanda Owethu, it means power to the people. And so that happens in 1935. The law is passed in 1936, and it basically sets up a Natives Representative Council. Well, the natives are going to be represented by a chief who's really under the direction of someone from the National Party that's not exactly going to rule in their best interests. In the interest of time here, we're going to move on to World War II. The war effort, for the United States, World War II brought the nation together. For South Africa, it kind of divided the nation. Some people say, why are we going to fight a war that's going to help the British? So what? They're getting pulverized by the Nazis. Serves them right for putting us in concentration camps. Right? So you're going to have the United Party, which is formed out of a coalition under Jan Smuts. Some people are going to be unhappy with him, see him as too English supporting. The National Party, obviously. The New Order and the OB, also in Brandbog. Those are two parties that are pretty radical. They are essentially Nazi supporters, and they're going to conspire against the war effort. They don't want the National Party to go down like this. And there's this thing that Winston Churchill and FDR get together and create the Atlantic Charter. And what that's going to say is it's going to talk about freedom of the seas, freedom from want, freedom from fear. And a lot of the ideas are going to be taken up by the ANC here. Quick notes on the ANC during the war years. Alfred Zuma is going to be the president of the ANC, and he wants youth and he wants action. It's not just about laws and passing things. And his wife, Maddie Hall Zuma, is going to be head of the Women's League. There's going to be a bus boycott in Alexandra, and it's going to be successful. The bus companies want to raise the rate by a cent. People can't honestly afford that. And so eventually the government has to step in because, well, if the factories aren't going, what's going to happen? Africans' Claims in South Africa is the document where the ANC takes the Atlantic Charter and creates their own demands. There's a youth league, and one of the main people you need to know is Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and Nelson Mandela is going to play a role. And all that leadership is going to be very, very influential. The Sofa Sanka movement, sometimes these workers set up these places outside of the urban areas, and they just were kind of squatting on the territory. And James Mpanza is not going to allow these people to move. And eventually he's going to succeed in establishing a new township. So you have some bus boycotts, you have some resistance towards moving because these workers wanted to live near their jobs and they didn't want to walk 10 miles a day simply because they have a skin color that's different from what the National Party wants. Okay? But the National Party is not in full power yet. In other news, the United Nations, there's this thing called the Yalta Conference, plans for a post-World War Europe and Asia and Africa, and basically they create a United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So what you need to know is that South Africa joins the United Nations. However, they do not sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights because that's in 1948, and that's the same year that there's an election. In other news, from 1946 to 1948, the Indian campaign basically said that Natal would be divided between the Indian area and the better area for the whites, and that the Indians somehow are going to get some sort of representation that actually doesn't exist. They call this the Ghetto Act, and it is rejected by the Indian community, the South African Indian community, SAIC, and the United Nations. There's a campaign that takes the works of Mahatma Gandhi and passive resistance, and it begins, and guess what? It works. Blacks and Indians joining forces, which is great, but don't get too used to it because the Ghetto Mano riots are going to divide these two groups, but then they're going to come together again. And so groups coming together is very influential. And to kind of round things up here, also 1946 is this mine workers strike, which is put down very violently. 75,000 gold miners are going to go on strike. And guess what? They're putting the mines of South Africa on hold. And so they're going to be put down very, very violently, kind of like Gilded Age things in the United States. Which brings us to this fear of different races coming together. A guy in Congress who seems to be supporting the English, and all these races coming together, fear of strikes and fear of communism, because ultimately the ANC is going to align itself with the Communist Party, brings you into the election of 1948. The National Party wins. Okay, they don't have a majority like 50%, but they do win the majority based on 36%. So they're going to hate the English, they're going to hate blacks, and they are going to hate the communists. And the Sauer report basically calls for racial discrimination. D.F. Malan, who's the head, becomes the prime minister, and this whole apartheid thing has been his brainchild since he was, one of the first to create the National Party, because anyone that was going to support the Union Party was seen as a traitor. And that brings you into all the apartheid laws. There are so many of them, but most of them, what you need to know, get passed in the first 5 years. They make communism illegal, they suppress free speech, movement, they establish pass laws. And if you understand that, you have a very good understanding of what's going on in South Africa during this time. So we've gone from colonization, we've gone to a union of South Africa, we've gone through world wars, and now here we are, post-World War II, and it seems like the world was fed up with fascism, but yet South Africa seems to be going in one direction as the world seems to be going in another direction in terms of democracy. So there's lots of content here. Study your notes, and may the force be with you. Thank you.